Hollywood and it's cool, yeah, 'cause you know it's real, oh baby. We'll never get old.
Hello everyone, welcome back to our second session. So in the second session we focus on paying out 5, right? And we continue to page 104, 105, the same page, right? But today we focus on the reading comprehension. It's about the tiniest computer in the world. So what does the tiniest computer name in the world, everyone remember? Okay, here, Raspberry Pi. Okay, yesterday I pronounced P, right? Not P, okay? So now you can change the pronunciation, Pi, okay? Raspberry Pi, okay? Good. Okay, so now before I read the passage for all of you, I would like you to listen to the track first, and after that I will read each paragraph and explain each paragraph about the main point to all of you. Then you will understand all the paragraphs clearly, right? Okay, now listen.
A. Listen and read. The tiniest computer in the world.
The Raspberry Pi is the tiniest, lightest computer available in the world. The largest Raspberry Pi model is 85 by 56 millimeters. It's not the brightest or most colorful, but it can teach students a lot about math and science. It's used in schools around the world. There are 3 generations of Raspberry Pi models. The first is Raspberry Pi. The second is Raspberry Pi 2. Now there's Raspberry Pi Zero. The Raspberry Pi Zero is the newest model, and it's also the least expensive. It only costs $5. Older models were $25 to $35. The Raspberry Pi was created by scientists in London. These scientists noticed that students in many countries were doing poorly on their computer science exams. They decided that the problem was that computers are very expensive. Many schools, especially those in poorer countries, could not afford them. So these scientists created an inexpensive computer to use in classrooms. Students can do many things with a Raspberry Pi. They can draw simple graphics, take pictures, and create stories. They can even record and play sound. Over 2 million Raspberry Pi Zero computers have been sold. Now there are even Raspberry Jam events. Raspberry Pi owners meet at these events to share knowledge. The scientists who created the Raspberry Pi hope every child will soon have their own computer.
Finish, everyone? Good. Okay, so after listening, I hope you can understand some part of the paragraph. And I will read each paragraph and explain you more, then you will understand all, right? Okay, so now let's read all together, everyone. The tiniest computer in the world. First paragraph. The Raspberry Pi is the tiniest, lightest computer available in the world. The largest Raspberry Pi model is 85 by 56 millimeters. It's not the brightest or most colorful, but it can teach students a lot about math and science. It's used in schools around the world. Okay, so the first one, they just give the general information about a Raspberry Pi, right? It's the tiniest, it's the tiniest and lightest, right? Tiniest and lightest computer in the world. So how big is the largest? Okay, the big one or the largest one is just 85 by 56 millimeter, right? Okay, this one, the largest one, very small, right? Okay, so Now let's continue to the second paragraph altogether. There are 3 generations of Raspberry Pi models. The first is Raspberry Pi. The second is Raspberry Pi 2. Now there's a Raspberry Pi Zero. The Raspberry Pi Zero is the newest model, and it's also the least expensive. It only costs $5. Older models were $25 to $35. The Raspberry Pi was created by scientists in London. The scientists noticed that students in many countries were doing poorly on their computer science exams. They decided that the problem was that computers are very expensive. Many schools, especially those in poorer countries, could not afford them. So, these scientists created an inexpensive computer to use in classrooms. Okay, so in the second paragraph, we focus on the 3 generations of Raspberry Pi, right? So, what are they? You remember? First, Raspberry Pi, right? Okay, first Raspberry Pi. Okay, how about the second one, everyone? Raspberry Pi 2. How about the last one? It must be Raspberry Pi Zero. Okay, this one number 2, not Z. Okay, again, so the first one, Raspberry Pi. The second one, Raspberry Pi 2, and the last one, Raspberry Pi Zero. It is the least expensive, right? Costs only $5. Yeah. Usually we use it in why do they create this computer, right? Why? Because in poorer country, right, they cannot buy expensive computer, so they can use this to do their science exam or their math exam on the computer. And it was created by what? By who? By scientists, right? By scientists in London. By scientists in London. Do you know London, everyone? London is in England, right? Okay, so here again, there are 3 generations of the Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi, Raspberry Pi 2, and Raspberry Pi Zero. And they are created by scientists in London. Why do they have to create this? Because they want to help the poorer country to do good, to do well on their science exams. Okay, so now let's continue to the last paragraph. Students can do many things with a Raspberry Pi. They can draw simple graphics, take pictures, and create stories. They can even record and play sound. Over 2 million Raspberry Pi Zero computers have been sold. Now, there are even Raspberry Jam events. Raspberry Pi owners meet at these events to share knowledge. The scientists who created the Raspberry Pi hope every child will soon have their own computer. Okay, so now I would like to ask you one question. So what can a Raspberry Pi do, or what can students do with Raspberry Pi? Okay, the student can draw what, everyone? Draw simple graphics, like a simple pictures like that. Okay, but we draw on computer. Okay, take what, everyone? Take pictures. Okay, we also use this to take pictures. Create what, everyone? Create stories. Okay, we can use this to create stories. Record and play sound. Okay, we can also record and play sound. Okay, so after reading each paragraph to all of you and after sum up or explaining each paragraph to all of you, I hope you can understand and you can answer all the questions below the paragraph, right? One paragraph we have one question. Yeah, you see the red one? Okay, so now let's answer the 3 questions altogether. Okay, 1. What is special about the Raspberry Pi? What is special about the Raspberry Pi? It is the tiniest and lightest computer in the world. Okay, this is special one. All right, so what else? It can teach students a lot about math and science, right? It can teach students a lot about math and science. Okay, how about the second question? What did scientists create or why? Why did scientists create the Raspberry Pi? Why? I already told you, right? Because in poorer country, they could not afford the expensive computer. So they can, and one more, because they do poorly, the students do poorly on their computer science exams. So the scientists decided to create the Raspberry Pi. Yeah. And it costs very cheap, right? Very cheap. Okay, so now let's continue to the last question. What can students do with a Raspberry Pi? Okay, remember 4 things, right? Draw simple graphics, take pictures, create stories, and record and play sound. Okay, so now we finish our page and we also finish our session. Okay, I hope you can understand more about Raspberry Pi and maybe some of you are interested in Raspberry Pi, right? Do you want to use Raspberry Pi? Maybe it's not available in our country yet, but I think we all will have soon. Okay, so this is the end of our video and see you in the next video. Goodbye, class.